Right, so good afternoon, everybody. Samantha Rees from the Australian Apartment Advocacy, and today we're talking about housing for our future amidst a housing crisis. And it might seem a bit of an oxymoron because everybody is now currently talking about housing affordability, children not getting into their homes in terms of buying a home, discrimination, for certain types of our economy or demographics. And so consequently, it's become a very hot topic, and hence why I'm delighted to actually invite Jeremy Schluter from Hassell and Andrew Elvin from Coast to Bay. Jeremy, you're in Sydney today, is that correct?
No, I'm in Melbourne today.
And Andrew's in the Gold Coast, which is great. So we've got two different perspectives here, or Sunshine Coast, should I say, for Coast to Bay. But the good news is both these companies are doing some great things in this space. So the Australian Apartment Advocacy, for those of you who don't know us, we're the voice of 2.5 million Australians who call apartments their home. And we're all about advocacy, we're all about education. We love to do research with these apartment owners so we can then guide policy and also government decision making. It was interesting this morning, I was on a Zoom call with Insurance Council of Australia, and they're putting a white paper to the federal government calling for greater protection. And whenever you have those kinds of bodies actually talking about that specific topic, you know you're going to get some traction. We're a company that is best known for the fact that we're trailblazers, we're tenacious, passionate, we like to have best practice, and we're all about empowerment. And certainly that is definitely both aligned with Hassell and also Coast to Bay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now move to Jeremy's slides, and what we're going to do is talk through both Jeremy plus also then Andrew's slides as well. Look at that. Look how tech savvy I am. All right. Can you see that, Jeremy?
No, it's still showing
my slides.
Yeah,
okay.
Your slide.
All right. What I'm going to do is then I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share this screen. Let's make sure that, yep.
There we go.
Is that okay? Fantastic. Yep. Great. Go for it, Jeremy.
If you move to the first slide, we always like to start these things with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners across Australia and the original custodians of the land and waters, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We think this is a really important thing to do because the continuous cultures that they have associated with this land and understanding of country enriches our story in Australia, which we believe enriches the places that we design and work in.
Thank you for doing that, Jeremy. It saved me doing it, darling.
So I'm going to try and quickly whip through a snapshot of the crisis, some of the context, but then we've got some of the stats and graphs which explain elements of the crisis, and then Andrew's going to talk specifically about affordable housing and his understanding and some stats and experiences around that. And then we've got three kind of hot topics at the end that we will finish with in a conversation. So as Sam said, rarely a day goes by without housing in the news. It's definitely a hot topic at the moment, and one that the industry, but the general public is talking about. Next slide, sorry.
I think I lost you there for a second, darling.
There we go. We know that Australia doesn't have enough housing. And we can't seem to build enough housing. And so without shelter, our well-being and resilience is challenged and our communities suffer. So we haven't invested as heavily as we're trying to and starting to do now in housing publicly since post-World War II. And that's part of the challenge that we're facing.
Well, what we don't want to do is build more of these, what you have in your picture either. I think that
No.
I think we've learned from that experience, haven't we?
Yes. Yes.
but certainly, yeah, I think that's important for us as well. Is that we're talking about we're meant to be
Yep,
delivering 250,000 homes per annum, and we're only delivering about 160,000,
that's
and
right.
so that's a definite shortfall. But that has been happening for some time, unfortunately. And I think what's actually happened
Yes.
is karma has now kicked us right royally, dare I say it, in the
Yep.
arse.
And look, it's not helping that there's global instability, as if it wasn't bad enough that we were dealing with one
Mm,
global war in Ukraine. Now we're dealing with the Israel and Palestine crisis. That has an impact on energy supply and costs, which
mm,
then makes housing even less affordable. Um, the instability has an impact on global security there, which impacts again food, energy, supply chains. If we go to the next slide. And the climate challenge is in sharp focus. This was a while ago now, but on the left was the Pakistani floods, where 1/3 of the entire country was underwater. But if floods aren't enough, we're also facing then bushfires. I know there's some bushfires in Queensland today, and we're only
mm,
in October, let alone with yeah, and tipping to be a dry summer. So climate is changing, and that has an impact on our houses and our cities.
mm. El Nino, here we come.
Mm. Populations are still climbing. At the end of 2022, we reached a global population of 8 billion. And the staggering thing is that that's grown by 7 billion in the last 200 years alone.
Mm,
So the population growth is staggering, which is yeah, again, not helping the housing issue.
mm.
But necessity is the mother of invention. So with this housing crisis, there is actually an opportunity for invention and for solutions and for innovation, and we think that is exciting.
I agree with you about that.
We must innovate, but what is out there? So that's what we want to look at towards the end. We're going to set out the challenge and then look at some of the things that are happening to respond to that challenge. What's out there, yeah, and what's the role of sustainability and well-being in as a part of this innovation? As Sam said, we know we need more housing, but we want to make sure we provide future-proof housing and quality housing. But we're also seeing investors are viewing the potential economic benefits of great homes and of sustainability and well-being as part of that conversation.
And I'm not sure if the granny flats, I think someone said the other day that they did analysis of what land was available on the East Coast, and there's potential to actually install another 64,000 granny flats in the backyards. But I don't know if everybody's ready for that kind of evolution. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's I think the reality of that is a slow burn, and that might take a little while. I don't disagree with it as a concept, but the reality of how long that might take, one by one by one. I certainly think the middle suburbs of our cities can increase their density. Um, yeah, and really, we're on the edge of a redefinition of Australian housing. A great Australian dream is changing with that migration to Australia. We're getting a demographic shift of millennials and migrants that are more accustomed to higher densities,
Mm,
and home ownership is becoming more out of reach, which actually means that some people are making that choice to rent longer term in suburbs that they want to live rather than buying where they can afford to, where they don't want to live. So rental in inner urban areas is actually a real housing alternative for some people.
I
So we'll
agree.
get to build to rent as a part of that conversation.
Correct.
Now, the some of the stats, the returning population growth. The federal government has recently forecast a national net migration of 400,000 in 2023, with about 50% of those coming from international students. Um, so yeah, the net migration at the start of last year in Melbourne alone was at a cyclical peak, the highest since 1981. So you can see on the graph there, the average is around that 50,000. But during COVID 2020 and 2021, obviously we reduced net migration in Australia as people went home.
Below the line. There we go.
Below the
Yeah.
line. But then you can see in 2021, 22, where it went higher than it had been through that entire period and all the way back to 1981, sorry. So yeah, there's Australia's population is expected to grow by 7.4 million, and this is just from October this year over the next 2 decades. So that's a lot of people coming into Australia and largely into our cities, but not exclusively, over the next 2 decades. So yeah, there's a lot of people coming in and they all need homes.
They love Australia. Yeah,
That too. Well, and supply is not meeting demand. So the recent Australian government goal of building over 1.2 million homes in the next 5 years to support access to housing and affordability, but detached housing starts are currently declining while apartment starts are accelerating. And so these stats are the actual building permits that are issued. And so the building permits that are issued is the most accurate kind of determinant of new houses that are being built. But you can see there that there were forecast to fall about 35,000 homes short each year under that goal on current projections. And the consistent undersupply of housing is part of the reason that is now effectively twice as unaffordable to buy a home in 2023 as it did nearly 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing, is that our income has just not stayed up to date with property prices, and the amount that you have to have deposit-wise, right, for a traditional home is just outside many people's realm.
Yep. One of the nuances of the housing supply challenge is that our household size is declining. So we had traditionally in 1985, we had about on average 2.9 people living in each household. Now it's about 2.49 people per household. And what that represents, you can see on the graph, the dropping and the red dots being the census data, the blue dots being kind of the average or the averaging out of that. We know in particular in Adelaide's population is somewhat stagnant. They have had, my family's in Adelaide, I was in Adelaide back in the year 2000. It was around 1 million population then, and it's around 1 million population now. But Adelaide even has a housing undersupply issue. And that's because if you assume a 1 million population, the 2.9 people per household versus 2.49 is 56,000 more homes just from the change in the household mix. So people are going to smaller homes. There are more people living on their own, more people are moving out, more couples are having less children. And all of those factors mean we need more homes than we have always needed per the population.
And they say we've got 13 million spare bedrooms in Australia, but I spoke to someone the other day and they were like, well, I'm not sure if I would like to share my 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home because I like to sit on the couch in my underwear and watch TV. And I said to this person, just put a TV in your bedroom. Then you can sit in the bedroom and watch TV. But I actually have, the castle is our home. I think we definitely have taken that to the extreme. Yeah.
Yep. And we know that rents are rising. They're rising at record levels. We recorded the strongest annual increase on record for the up to April this year, and you can see there. These are the quarterly. Sorry, this is the annual change in rental rates. You can see, so it has dipped a little bit in the last quarter in August 2023, but dipped from 10% to 9%. And you can see the stats there of the annually on the left, 11.7% increases nationally to April, 19% across Sydney, and 15.2% across Melbourne.
And it was interesting because at the Build to Rent conference last week, they were talking about the Greens kind of like with the next federal election really going in hard on the rental cap. because
Mm,
they know that that will appeal to that younger market.
mm,
And that's what they're relying on. So, this has occurred elsewhere around the world, and there was definitely some concerns around that because while you want to provide affordable housing,
mm,
at the same time, rental caps is not going to actually help the marketplace either.
mm. Look, it is interesting. I know the build to rent sector is also acutely aware that if rents rise too much, all of a sudden the cost of renting versus the cost of buying changes. And
Mm,
so they don't want it to increase too much
mm.
because it still needs to be an alternative to buying. Um, but we also don't want to um, cap things so that we can slow the growth. I think there is a balance between affordability and letting the market decide. And look, rental vacancies is the other challenge. Unfortunately, they are at historic levels. And um, once the vacancy rates are lower, that fuels the increase in rents. So that kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Perth sits at a vacancy rate of 0.69%. And there are fueling rising homelessness over there. There are people with six-figure salaries that can't find a home just because there's not access to it. That's partly fueled over there by the cost of construction, which has meant the supply of new homes is even less. But you can see there across the different states and capitals, just about a 1% or just over average. It's pretty low in terms of the vacancy rates. It's pretty alarming.
It is, and of course, all you need to have is like 25 people standing outside a rental, and then suddenly the frenzy starts, right? So they're
Hmm.
offering, 2-year rent up front and all those kinds of things. And that just leaves your average person well
Mm,
actually disadvantaged.
yeah. And the a lot of the homeowners are crying poor or worried about their market rate. Overall, we feel that the housing values are still doing okay on the longer term. They have had, you can see there, some drops in the last few years, but they are coming back and they are still stable. We don't expect sales rates and for apartments or homes to be going down too much from that kind of average, but in the longer term, they're still benefiting. So yeah, and then we know that there is a challenge in the construction sector. So builders are going broke. We know that interest rates rises are hurting construction costs. Um, what's happening in China and Asia, they have a slowing population now, and so they're actually heading the opposite way to a housing oversupply, which means some developers can't finish apartments that have already been purchased off the plan. So all of this is part of the conversation in why we have a housing undersupply. When housing costs go up, but they're going up more than the slightly steady cost of sales, it makes it harder for projects to stack up, which means there's less of a supply of apartments out there in the market.
There was one today in or in Brisbane, Queensland, that went under as well. So
Mm,
I've heard the other day 225% increase in building companies have gone under in the last 12 months. Unfortunately, 59% of those are in New South Wales.
mm, mm. And the unfortunate result of some of these factors is that two-thirds of young Australians don't believe they'll ever own a home. That's from the Age Resolve polling. Um, Even if they're middle income earners. And the stats back this up, but the current home ownership rates for those aged 25 to 34 are about 56% and dropping compared to 63% back in 1981.
Mm,
So we know that home ownership is declining. And as I said earlier, some of those young Australians are being proactive in choosing different housing alternatives and different
mm,
housing lifestyles.
mm.
And maybe that's okay. It's just an adjustment that we have to our traditional housing assumptions and norms in this country.
Mm.
But also Australians are under more housing stress than any other nation. So I found this incredible when the IMF has said that Australia is the highest level of mortgage stress in the developed world. 15% of income is devoted to paying off loans. And the increased cost of borrowing has left Australia at the top of the league for debt, with Canada second, followed by Norway and the Netherlands. So, but there is hope, and what we'll talk about in a minute, once I'll hand over to Andrew, is that we think that the best thing we can do as an industry is, if you go to the next slide, is have great examples of urban housing so that we can build more urban housing, so that we can provide access to housing, but also more affordable housing. We know that if we can provide more supply with the supply and demand, we can try to keep the cost of housing down. It's still a challenging market, and that's different to the affordable housing component of that. But we know that NIMBYism is it's a real barrier to providing housing supply. And if we don't provide urgent housing supply, the affordability is not going to move.
Well, I know the Premier for New South Wales, and also today Megan Scanlon, who's the Minister for Housing in Queensland, have basically said they're prepared to take on the NIMBYs and push through housing. So I think maybe our days of NIMBY may be over.
Well, hopefully, Sam, and I know the Victorian government's housing statement has provisions in there where the state government can take on planning approvals, and they're removing the third-party review and feedback rights. So that will streamline and take some of the politics, hopefully, the local politics, out of some planning approvals and housing supply. But more about affordable housing, Sam, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. So before we quickly start with Andrew, I should say that Andrew actually was the recipient of the inaugural Queensland Apartment Awards for Excellence this year as the leading sector for the apartment sector of Shining Light. And Andrew's going to talk to us about what they have been doing at Coast to Bay. But Coast to Bay is only one of 39 Tier 1 providers in this kind of affordable housing space in the country. And so we're very delighted that you could join us today, Andrew. Thank you.
No, that's great. So I am the CEO of Coast to Bay Housing Group, but I'm also on the Community Housing Industry Association, both in Queensland on the board and also federally as well. And federally, we've had some great progress in the last couple of years or so in terms of engaging with the government about getting policy positions right to actually make sure that our sector, but more generally, we're getting more houses on the ground to actually meet those needs that Jeremy outlined. So community housing providers in Australia have really been operating for around 30 or 40 years. This is a European type model. They're called different things in Europe, but in the UK I'm most familiar with, they're called housing associations, and we're nearly all housing charities and public benevolent institutions, and we get the tax concessions on GST, and we also very often get rates concessions. We're nationally regulated industry through the National Regulatory Scheme for Community Housing, and they're state-based funding models and oversight of the regulated sector. And there are three tiers, as Sam said. Tier 1s are really the ones that are both developers and managers of large portfolios. And I would say the concept of community housing providers, we are the original build to rent suppliers for Australia. And what I mean by that is we build largely through capital grants, sometimes with a little bit of lending, but we build to hold in perpetuity. And even if we as an entity disappear, another community housing provider receives the equity and takes over management. So we're the original build to rent suppliers in perpetuity.
I love that.
This is a model I use quite often. We're involved in many sectors. Most of us aren't involved in homelessness services, but we link to homelessness services. But you can see there that community housing providers really straddle, special disability housing, but also into market real estate agents. We've also got a not-for-profit real estate under our group of companies, and the financial models you can see there, from philanthropy through to social impact investing, which is usually what the governments do, through to market and private investment. And most tier one community housing providers do joint ventures with the private sector, as well as their own developments that they do directly. And what's happening in the Housing Australia Future Fund that's just around the corner is really to accelerate that process of having subsidies come to community housing providers as opposed to capital grants in the first place.
Yeah, because I guess the capital grants process can be quite convoluted, right? And so we want to kind of like streamline that to a certain extent, don't we, Andrew?
Absolutely, and we want to get volume. So the Housing Australia Future Fund is 500 million each year. That doesn't go a long way if it's only for capital, but it goes a long way if it's subsidy based. And so the biggest example we've got in Australia is mum and dad investors through the National Rental Affordability Scheme. The subsidy there was just over $11,000, and that for just over 300 million of federal government funding each year over 10 years. That got us 37,000 affordable housing outcomes. So the Housing Australia Future Fund is, in some senses, taking that idea and making it more aggregate and trying to get institutional investment in to get the same outcomes. There needs to be a national recognition that we need a standard affordable housing definition. Sometimes it's just related to a discount to market rent, but for any investment to be really effective, and I'm really just quoting from what the State of the Nation's Housing Report is from NIFIC that was published this year in February, we really need the subsidies to be targeted at the most needy groups and the low income groups. So if we can target the increased asset class in building to rent to those that are most disadvantaged in being able to participate in the rental market, all the better, and that will require national definition about incomes. The Housing Australia Future Fund and the fund that we're operating in Queensland are effectively assistance agreements over 20 to 25 years, or a gap subsidies, and the models are really drawn from international models around public-private partnerships. And what I think Build to Rent does actually open up for us is to really provide greater scale and scope for institutional investment to be aggregated. And I believe very strongly that we need metropolitan models and regional models, because the metropolitan models won't work on the Sunshine Coast and other regions in Queensland, and I don't think they'll work in the regions across other jurisdictions too. And so we need a better way to get that density and the scale in place.
Now, why is that, Andrew? So why are you feeling that? What's specific about the regions in comparison to metropolitan that we need to be conscious of?
Well, it'd be very unusual here on the Sunshine Coast for a private developer to do anything over 100, 120 apartments in one go. Yeah. Whereas in the metro areas, you're looking, 200, 250. We just don't have the development at that scale, and I don't think we have the community sentiment that would back something of that scale either. And particularly if you go in higher, that's the big issue here on the Sunshine Coast. We need to be able to do density without it necessarily being, the tower blocks.
As I call it, density.
Yeah. So the role of registered community housing sector is we are developers when we do things directly, but we also do a lot of joint ventures with private developers, and we certainly did through the NRAS development through to over that 3-year period from 2011 to 2014. Our planning frameworks are exactly the same as the private sector, but I think we need models that certainly work in metro areas, but we also need to provide greater innovation, I think, at that middle ring. And you mentioned this, Jeremy. How do we actually get density in the middle ring and make the value both in metropolitan areas, but where we are in the regions too? And I think there will be a national discussion on the use of tax and planning incentives to try and get build to rent really working for Australia as a whole.
Well, certainly we're seeing, I saw something in the news this week, and correct me if I'm wrong in terms of what state, or maybe it was even overseas, but they are fast tracking anything that basically is deemed to be affordable housing. So the planning approvals are being fast tracked. And I think that's an incentive also for the private sector who may want to put their toe in that kind of, market. Yeah.
So here on the Sunshine Coast, we've got a commitment from the Sunshine Coast Council that they'll try and get our DA and BA through in 6 weeks. So that'll be great for any developments that we do.
Yeah. Well, in this one, I think it was like 2 weeks, which I think is fantastic, because that's, to be tied up for 18 months or nearly 2 years with a planning process, that kills anything that might have once been affordable, correct?
That's right. So Housing Australia Future Fund is for both social and affordable housing product. They're largely subsidy-based models, and there will be some small capital grants. There's some particular demographic groups that the federal government want to see stock come forward through for pretty quickly, like families impacted by domestic and family violence and veterans. And there's obviously going to be a key role for the community housing providers. So the target that's being spruiked at the moment is 30,000 new affordable housing through the Australia Housing Future Fund. I think it's going to be largely the case that will be delivered either directly through community housing providers or community housing providers working in joint ventures with the private sector. And there's current discussions on the capital stacks and the financial models to make it work. There are also state-based housing programs. In Queensland, we have the Queensland Housing Investment Growth Initiative and the Housing Investment Fund, where there's been 2 rounds. And we also have the Quick Start Capital Program, which is mainly for social housing, which is open just to community housing providers. And we have an emerging build to rent program that has been led by Treasury with some projects in Brisbane. And other states, I think, have similar programs or are going to have similar programs fairly quickly as the Housing Australia Future Fund practical application of that rolls out.
Are you seeing that in Melbourne as well, Jeremy?
Yeah, we are. The recent housing statement has some fast-tracked approvals with affordable housing components, and Sydney has taken a similar approach, but has looked at increased yields, increased density, FSR, for sites with minimum affordable housing components. So look, it's good to see so far governments have avoided the temptation to go down the stick path and have been using more carrots. We've certainly seen in Sydney some developers readjusting their applications based on introducing more affordable housing components and therefore increasing the yields.
So
this is just to see that already in Melbourne.
So this is just what we have to go through. All of these processes will be competitive processes, even though the states will probably get their allocation of outcomes from the Housing Australia Future Fund. When they come to the state, there'll be rounds of procurement, which we hope will be simple. But basically, this model applies that CHP or a developer really needs to define the need, look at the targets in terms of target cohorts and product, and then come up with a housing solution. So it won't be as simple as saying, I've got a development site, I can build 60. You actually got to go through this process, because obviously what the Housing Australia Future Fund wants to do is to target those outcomes to meet those specific demographic need and the targets. And so there's a lot of work that will need to go in to actually make sure that there's a nuanced approach to the bids that are successful.
And you've certainly seen that, haven't you? I don't know if you've got actually some of those examples in here, Andrew, where you've actually looked at a site that previously had a certain volume on there, and you've been able to actually add volume by reconfiguring the site. Yes?
That's right. We have done that, but also I think one of the other things is that we might look at a site and reject a site. It might stack up for a private developer, but it won't necessarily stack up for really pertinent build to rent. So there's all sorts of things about transport links, you know, how it's located in the suburb, whether there's a relative oversupply of social and affordable housing at the moment. So there's a lot of key criteria that come into picking a site. So this is a little bit of a model. So obviously what we're trying to work with in our joint ventures is that the proponent, who might be a private sector developer, works with us. And the majority of a site might be for market sales or market rent. And we come along and provide the affordable housing model. They might sign the delivery deed and the operational deed with government. And we back that up with a head lease, which is a commercial lease over 20-25 years. We're a participant in the scheme. So the proponent gets all of the for that element of affordable housing, gets all of the concessions because they're partnering with us. There might be an infrastructure agreement that ties this all together, and then we obviously are the experts at managing that in relation to the affordable housing tenant. And just to the next model is just how does the financial model work? It's just a simplification of it, really. We know what the affordable discounted rents are going to be on that Y figure. We have to work out with the proponent what the Z figure is, and all of those activity costs, including compliance, are in there. But also, most of these schemes are requiring the asset to be maintained properly over the lifetime of that 20-25 years. And just at the bottom, the cream on top is if we can also get the rates concessions to pass on to the proponent. That's how effectively the model works.
And that's that, you know, I think you say that you've simplified that. I think that that's quite a difficult process that you've got mapped out here on your slide, Andrew. Like, obviously, what are some of the learnings that you've had while you've been applying this kind of model? What has worked for you and what hasn't?
Look, I think it's really looking at, and go back to that need, that funnel, that inverted triangle. We've really got to try and add, you know, bring all of those elements together to the satisfaction of not just the funding body, but the joint venture partner. And so, you know, there are build to rents that are really premium products, and although they're discounted to, you know, a premium rent, don't actually meet this, you know, target. And obviously, you know, the subsidy needs to give an effective return on investment if the proponent, the private sector partner, is going to hold the stock for a long period of time. The other thing that we found is that most private sector developers don't want all of the hassle of the operational deeds, which are very, very complicated deeds around compliance criteria and all the rest of it. The compliance for NRAS was really complicated, and the compliance for this is going to be equally complicated. So sometimes it's just, it's better to do it without that subsidy coming from the government. And so there is a process of sort of orientating people to how the model works.
It's interesting, Andrew, this model looks to me very similar to a build to rent model in that for build to rent to work, it's a long-term investment that has to be
Yes,
sustainable over 30 years, right? So you
yes,
really need to understand your need and the specific target and the
yes,
demographic and the area, and you have to do a lot of work up front to make sure what you're building now is going to work for the next 30 years. And so it's a good
correct.
call out that affordable housing is not just we'll put 5% in there and that will work. You actually need to make sure the 5% or the 10% or the 20% you're putting in really meets that need and therefore is a viable long-term kind of investment.
Yeah, and from the government's perspective, they obviously don't want to give a commitment for a subsidy that's not actually going to be taken up by somebody that's the target cohort for them. So they want the subsidy to meet the need, and they're looking really targeting at, you know, the low to moderate incomes, nothing more than that. So I've got a couple of examples that we have done our own development on, and this is really addressing how do we get, you know, density done well, or gentle density, or whatever it is. So this is just one that we've done for, we did directly for a social housing product, but it's actually it's the affordable rents in the social housing, so it's slightly higher rent than the normal social housing rent models across Australia. And so we purchased a site in 2021 that had a DA for 25 3-bedroom townhouses, but the need is obviously not for 3 bedrooms, it's 1 and 2 bedrooms. So on the same footprint, we were actually able to get 33 housing outcomes, and this really addresses that point that you raised, Jeremy. How, you know, if we're seeing the average number of people per households dropping to that 2.49, then there's a huge demand for 1 and 2 bedrooms. These are 1 bedrooms, really well designed 1 bedrooms, but they're 2 bed, 2 bath. And we've got a second phase of this development where we'll be able to get a further 6 to 10 units. So instead of there being 25 outcomes, you've potentially got 43 outcomes. We went to the we just adjusted the footprint, but no real increase in the GFA, and we were able to get a minor amendment to the DA through fairly quickly. And strong use of European design, in the subtropical environment, and a real environmental focus. And this is a bit of gold, because we hit when land costs were just in that tricky bit post-COVID, and total development costs were 320,000 per housing outcome. So that's affordable from the government, but also it's affordable for us because we have an element of borrowing in this, and obviously we need the rents to be able to pay down principal and interest over 25 years. And the next one is Yandina, which is just coming up to practical completion now. And this is even better. So there was a DA for 15 3-bedroom townhouses, and that got amended for 26 units, 1, 2 and 3. Again, it's an under-over design. But some of these developments are, instead of there being a 3-bedroom townhouse, it's 3 1-bedroom units on the same footprint. And the total development costs there, because the land was quite a complicated land because of flood mitigations, etc., rose to just under 400,000 per housing outcome. So here we're getting 73% of additional household outcomes on the same footprint, and you know, we're quite proud of this in terms of its design, and it's much better, superior to a lot of the private sector unit developments that are in this street where we've done this development. So this is the kind of regional approach to build to rent that we think is going to work pretty well, you know, between 25 and 35 in multiples, you know, in a really good setting that gets, you know, broad community support without us having to, you know, do the 60, 70, 80 apartments and go high.
And I think, you know, at the end of the day, it's about simplifying it. So developers are always looking about what they can value add that will increase the price, whereas you're coming at it from a perspective of what do we need to provide that's going to be adequate and still a safe place to live, but it's going to have that cost, equation to it, correct?
That's right. And in the allocations for both of these projects, we've got women over 55 who, can't continue to rent in the private market, as well as a mixture of, family groups, single parents, and we really work hard to get an intentional community in those developments.
And I think that's, that was what came up with the build to rent that I attended last week, was about the multi-family kind of, residence.
Yeah.
Because and someone asked the question, well, it's not families living there, but the idea is that we create a family within that complex, and that's why it's called multifamily, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Now I've got some questions here, but thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate those practical examples that you've provided, because I think everybody keeps talking about affordability, but you, my darling, are actually walking the walk and talking the talk, which is awesome to see. So I think Jeremy's got a few extra slides that he just wants to talk to before we'll actually go to questions. Is that correct, Jeremy?
Yeah, let me run through these really quickly, because what we're seeing, 3 trends that are impacting the housing crisis. If we go to the next slide, one of them is the idea of creating community. So we must create strong communities and environments for better, more inclusive future. That's socially oriented neighbourhoods. Beyond mere sustainability and resilience, they need to truly integrate that mix of housing. So really strong communities and strong master plans have a mix of aging in place units, of affordable units, of rental, of purchase, of build to rent, of first home buyers, as well as then commercial and public uses. So not just housing enclaves. And it needs to have some equitable housing access, because the vulnerable are too often missing out. The importance of intergenerational living, providing specific things within master plans and within apartment designs that promote aging in place and dignity for our seniors, because the built environment impacts our physical and mental well-being. So we need to design human-centric homes. Now on the next one, Sam, we've covered this a fair bit, but build to rent is not a silver bullet to our housing crisis, but it is a part of the mix. There are other new models of housing, like build to rent to own, like the assemble model. And what we're finding in the build to rent sector is the more of it we have in Australia, the more we're getting diversity within the build to rent sector. So a lot of people are talking about the premium end of build to rent, but there are others like Assemble, like Local, and Sentinel that have different targets. UCO targeting a different co-living sector, and some are targeting family-friendly apartments, some are targeting key worker housing, where they know they can get long-term rental security, they don't need to release the apartments, and others are targeting 10 to 15% minimum affordable housing components within their build to rent. Some are targeting disability housing specifically, because they know they're a stable tenant that provides stable revenue and has some backing from the NDIS. So there is some diversity, and we need everything and more, not just one solution.
That's correct, because what did come out at the conference last week is that the appetite for venture capital to actually invest into build to rent is pretty low. And what they're talking about is scalability. So any venture capitalist will tell you, well, how can this go from, Sydney to Australia to international? And it's very hard when you're kind of looking at these models, but to not actually have a local context to it, right?
Yeah. So it needs to be embedded in its local site. And the final thing we've kind of touched on is that we need quality density to promote supply. We need to de-fear urban housing, and make sure that people feel safe and comfortable and know that they can create good environments and great communities through urban density and through apartments and through affordable housing components. And then I can have a go at, there's been a question around the inclusional zoning
Yes,
to
yes,
either encourage developers with fast track planning approvals or mandate affordable community housing, e.g. 10% of dwellings.
yes.
Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of mandatory controls. I'm a huge fan of discretionary controls. And I think promoting affordable housing through fast track planning approvals or density benefits rather than mandating is a better way to get stronger outcomes. If you're mandating minimum affordable housing components for everyone and every development, sometimes you don't actually get the right outcome, because we know that people that are looking for affordable housing are actually not looking for it everywhere. Some of them are not wanting to live in Camberwell, right? Some of them are not wanting to live in Double Bay. So if there's an apartment development going up in some of those more affluent suburbs and there's no demand for affordable housing, if we have mandatory affordable housing components, we're just building it for the sake of building it everywhere. So I think we should be promoting benefits to affordable housing and letting the market decide. But we definitely should be providing those incentives. I don't know, what do you think, Andrew?
I'm a fan of inclusionary zoning. I think where it's been tried, by offering incentives in terms of increased density and things like that, there's a nervousness, I think, that it actually gets delivered and it's delivered correctly. I mean, obviously in the UK, they have a different way of doing mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is the Section 106 payments. So they actually charge and then recycle that into, specific projects. So there's different ways to do it. But unless we actually, in Australia, find a way of actually building properties for those low to moderate income groups, either to buy or to rent, then we're going to have, we're going to continue to have this rental crisis. And so I think it's up to federal government to get the tax settings right, but also to work with state governments to get the planning right, so that we can actually get the density that we need, and to get that targeted. So I am a fan of inclusionary zoning, but I agree that there's different ways to do it, and there's complications in making it happen.
Yeah, and it's a matter of getting the settings right, and then it can be scaled up and ramped up. Most of the developers we talk to are actually not as afraid of affordable housing as you might think. They know that a lot of them are used to it in different jurisdictions, so they just want certainty. So we need to make sure that we have certainty on what is required, and then those developers can price sites accordingly and deliver the housing accordingly.
And look, for developers to work with community housing providers, we can often de-risk a development for them by either, take out at the end in terms of, purchasing the product itself, or actually entering in, if it's a build to rent scheme, entering into a process where it's de-risked for the investor, so that they get a guarantee, and we take all of the risk in terms of the filling and the vacancy and all the other bits.
And it's been a challenging process, but I think we're seeing it more and more being provided. More and more developers understand how it works and are embracing it and leaning into the provision of affordable housing within their developments. So I think that will only continue to grow over the coming years.
I think there is a stigma around what is social housing as well. So I think, we've got NIMBYs against apartments, but we've also got a NIMBY movement against social housing. And I think there is a role for government to play in actually educating people, because as Andrew would know, the biggest cohort of people who are needing that social housing at the moment are females, in their over 55 years of age, who have not been income earners and are relying on the sale proceeds from the family home, and don't have a superannuation. So, I think there's a lot to be discussed about what does social housing represent. Do you agree?
I do, and look, we were doing some analysis on the Sunshine Coast earlier today about, low to moderate income groups in three key sectors. So it's the caring sector, it's the retail sector, and it's, government administration sector, where virtually nobody on the Sunshine Coast can actually afford the rents, if they're on those kind of key worker levels. So we can't operate, our basic industries and sectors anymore here on the Sunshine Coast we won't be able to unless we actually get, some affordable rental into the mix. Because Jeremy, our vacancy rate has been below 1% for 20 years, and our market rents went up about 45% over the last 2 years on the Sunshine Coast. So that just makes it completely unaffordable for the low to moderate income groups.
Well, you've actually had documented on the Sunshine Coast, haven't you, Andrew, about communities that are living in their cars, and they kind of like come together every evening, and they form their own community in a sense, in that kind of like realm.
Yeah. And I think it has impacts on transport. So people are moving out and then, clogging up all the transport links, across the Sunshine Coast. The same happens on the Gold Coast, so the whole thing is, bound together.
Well, I think that's been a very interesting conversation, and I'm very grateful to both Andrew and also Jeremy for taking us on that pathway. Jeremy, do you have some comments in closing?
Oh, look, we always like to finish with an optimistic ending. As we said before, with necessity and a crisis comes opportunity to innovate. And we think that the future is bright and we can unlock the potential for innovation and creativity. So thanks, Sam and Andrew, and everyone for joining the conversation.
Yeah. So we have some other events coming up over the course of November, including a think tank, apartment think tank in Queensland on the 3rd of November. We also are talking about landlords. We're also talking about waterproofing and how to choose a 5-star strata manager. So if you're looking for any of those, head onto our website and take a look. But thank you very much to Andrew and Jeremy today for taking the time out to take us through what's actually happening in real terms on the ground. And I think that kind of discussion needs to happen on a broader scale nationally, Andrew. If only I could clone you and take you to every state, I would be so blessed. So thank you again, both Jeremy and Andrew, for your time today. And thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right. Take care, guys. Thank you very much, both of you. See you.